Hey, thanks so much for checking us out here on Harvest Online. No matter where you're watching, when you're watching, we're so glad you made us a part of your day. We are right in the middle of a series called The Space Between Us. We're talking about politics, we're talking about culture, we're talking about some biblical themes, and so certainly hope you are enjoying it. We just got finished with part 1 and part 2 that we called Unique. Talked about how the church is not a puzzle piece that didn't fit. And so we would love for you to stay tuned. Today, we're going to talk about who is my neighbor and who is a neighbor. Before we do that, if you would click that subscribe button, that would be awesome. Hop over to the other socials, Facebook and Instagram, harvest.247, and check those out too. Like and subscribe and follow and all those things. And also, if you would check us out, harvest247.org, we would love for you to do that. And so we are going to move on from this idea that the church was unique and it wasn't a puzzle piece that did not fit. And we're going to kind of talk about in the next few sermons about what that looks like and what that means. And so today we're going to talk about neighboring. And so we're going to be Luke 10, 25 through 36. We're going to hop right into this right off the top. And then we're going to go through and kind of look at what this means for us. And this is what Jesus is saying. He says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Actually, Luke is writing this. Jesus is talking. What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, as we often do. So he asked Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? So he's saying, well, love my neighbor as myself, but who is my neighbor? I mean, because if they don't vote like me or they don't think like me, I mean, do I really have to tell them, are those people considered my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Verse 31, a priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. Now, what's important is Jews and Samaritans did not get along. So Jesus is using this in saying that the Samaritan is the one that actually came and helped him when culturally that was typically not the norm. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expenses you may have. Verse 36, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? 2 questions, similar but different. These questions seem the same on the surface, however, they are different based on who asked them and how they are asked. The first question was asked by an expert in rabbinical law who had just asked Jesus how to live forever. And the second question was asked by Jesus, who told a story before asking the second question. So let's look at these 2 questions and look at how they're different. The first question is, who is my neighbor? I would imagine the first question was asked by the expert, was asked with a posture of challenge. Okay, so who is my neighbor? You know, if somebody were to cross their arms and lean back, so who is my neighbor? You know, somebody who would ask it with that face, with that tone. Who is my neighbor, right? That's asked more of a challenge. Like, I'm going to ask you a gotcha question. You ever been in a conversation when someone's asked you a gotcha question, you know what they're trying to do, right? You're sitting back, arms folded. I could just imagine that scene. It's almost not a question at all. It's almost rhetorical, right? It was asked by a man who was possibly trying to get out of being empathetic or compassionate and preserve his comfortable way of life. Meaning, I want to live forever, but I don't necessarily know if I want to get uncomfortable. Trying to get by with the bare minimum, I think, is what he's probably trying. asking how much in enough to be a neighbor, right? How much is it to be a neighbor? How much do I have to give? How much do I have to sacrifice? Do I have to talk with somebody I don't want to talk with? I mean, I don't like the way that person dresses. I mean, they don't really root for my team. You know, that, do I really have to do that? Meaning, what is the minimum I can do to look like a neighbor to everybody else, but not go to the depths of actually being a neighbor? That's the first question. Second question is, who was a neighbor? Not who is a neighbor, but who was a neighbor. Not, identifying this person as a neighbor or whatnot, but identifying a neighbor based on what they did. Jesus asked the second question after he told a story about doing something after someone had been a neighbor. I mean, you're talking about Jew and you're talking about Samaritan. You're talking about two groups of people that didn't really interact, right? You're talking about like two groups of people that don't really like each other. You know, in the political realm, it's like they don't really cross the aisles well, right? They're not really like that. You could probably think of some politicians that wouldn't really cross the aisles. You can think of some fan bases that don't cross the aisles. You could probably think of some people in your own life, brothers, sisters, moms, whatever it is, cousins. I don't really like to cross the aisle with that person, right? This was asked, though, by Jesus in the past tense. This is not a question of posture, but a question of lived experience. Because what Jesus was doing is showing the expert of the law what being a neighbor was all about by using a very intentional story that put Jew and Samaritan in the same story, where the Samaritan was helping the Jew. Meaning that it's not that we are to be neighbors when someone looks like us. We're not to be neighbors necessarily only when they vote like us, when they wear the same clothes that we have, but we're to be neighbors even to our enemies. And Jesus says, who's my neighbor? With a compassion and abundance, with a view of the person needing help. Because that's what neighboring really is. In the story, neighboring really is a view of the person needing help, meaning neighboring is centered on others. It's not centered on me. It's not centered on us individually or personally. It's centered on others. It's saying when somebody needs help, the call for me as a follower of Jesus is to be a neighbor. No matter the divide, no matter the socioeconomic status, no matter the cultural differences, no matter if they speak my language or not. Neighboring is centered on others. When we think about centering, we think about this idea that centering is what we give our attention to, what we focus on, and what compels us. What is being a good neighbor like, right? What is it that our attention is on? Where is our focus? What is compelling us? The Good Samaritan in the story shows us that centering on our neighbors requires us to shift our attention and focus on our neighbors. This is very hard to do. It's very hard for me, especially when I have like a schedule and I got this and then this and then this, and I walk by someone, I know that they need help, but I also know it's going to take me 30 minutes to get to the next thing, and if I help, then I might be late. I mean, it's a simple illustration, but it's attention. But that's exactly what neighboring is. It's putting our attention and our focus on others. It's being not just doing. Being neighboring flows from the heart. It's saying, I want to be a good neighbor. I want to love people. I want to have a heart of compassion, right? But it's also doing and not just being. Doing is putting our heart into action, not just talking about it. Because sometimes we have the heart to be compassionate. We know we're supposed to be compassionate. When we see somebody on the side of the road, we feel sadness or compassion. And so like neighboring is both the doing and it's also the being. It's allowing the compassion and the love and the call of God on our life from our heart flow out into our action. And so Jesus uses the Good Samaritan story as a way to illustrate what neighboring is and what neighboring looks like. And neighboring is centered on others. So, one of the things I want to talk about is somebody that is in my disciple group. And one of the things I love about this idea of centering and focusing is how they are centered and focused on a couple of their neighbors. There's a gentleman and his wife that are in our church, and he's been a pastor and done some small group stuff and all of these things. And one of his focuses is two neighbors. And the goal is, he's like, I just want to get them into a Discovery Bible study. I just want to talk to them about Jesus. I just want to share the truth of God's Word with them. And over the course of months, I mean, he's just been so focused and centered on them. He was telling me a story about how he actually went with his neighbor to help him drop off something and pulled the trailer and helped him out, and how he'd go over to his house and help him out. And the neighbor will come over and help him. And I'm like, man, what a beautiful picture of neighboring. Right, all while he's had an injured arm, all while he's had some turbulent things going on in his family, he's still praying and has this heart for a neighbor. Why? Because he's centered on it. He's allowed the being from his heart, the compassion, the love for his neighbor from his heart to kind of spill over into doing, meaning there's practical steps. Even though he before moving in, he didn't know this neighbor. They have different backgrounds, different thought processes on things, but he still wants to love his neighbor, because that is what neighboring from Jesus' perspective is. It's centered on others. Now let's read Luke 10:37. And let's see what happens. And the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. That's what he replied to Jesus. Because he said, who is the neighbor? And the expert said, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, now go and do likewise. And so when we sit here and think about, well, if neighboring is centered on others, what is the heart posture that allows us to center on others? What is the heart posture that allows us to put our neighbors in our center, in our focus before ourselves? And in the answer, the expert of the law nails it. It's mercy. It's that the Samaritan looked at the Jew and didn't say, well, it's not the right time of day. Well, you know what? I have an excuse. I'm a Samaritan. He's a Jew. I don't really have to help him. I didn't really do this to him. Like, it's really not my responsibility. No. What he said is that he looked at him and had a heart of mercy, a heart of compassion for him. And so at the center of neighboring is a heart of mercy. It happens when we look upon somebody else, our neighbor who needs help, and says, but I have mercy on them, and therefore I'm going to allow the mercy to pull me into action to help them. I have mercy. The expert of the law knew who the true neighbor was, yet he could not bring himself to say the name Samaritan. He couldn't even do it. He's like, no, the one who had mercy on him. He didn't say, well, the Samaritan. We might have expected him to be an enemy, but he was instead a neighbor who showed mercy on him. And then Jesus says to him, go and do likewise. Right? So he answers the question and then moves to application. That I am to love my neighbor, and my neighbor is the one who others might consider my enemy. That could be a neighbor. And that I'm supposed to have compassion. And what Jesus says is that I'm supposed to have mercy and a heart of mercy that moves me to help my neighbor, even if that person in need is my enemy. Essentially, my neighbor is the one with a need right in front of me. My neighbor is the one with a need that is right in front of me. Enemy or not, speak my language or not, vote like I do or not, have the same political perspective as I do or not, have the same cultural views that I do or not, go to the same church as I do or not, that my neighbor is the one with a need right in front of me. At the center of neighboring is a heart of mercy. And that's what Jesus calls us to do. In this political environment, in this cultural, social environment that is so about division and so about saying, but you don't belong to this tribe and you don't identify as this and you do identify as this and I don't identify as that, and so therefore I'm not going to help and I can't cross the aisle and all this stuff. What Jesus is saying with this parable is this, is that we are to be neighbors to anyone in need right in front of us. The Samaritan and Jews were enemies. They didn't get along, but he had mercy for him and therefore was his neighbor. It doesn't matter, Jesus is saying, do they give the same amount as I do, make the same amount as I do? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter the background. Jesus is saying that your neighbor is the one in need that is right in front of you. And what matters, like we saw last week in the unique, is our witness of Christ to others. And so at the center of neighboring is a heart of mercy. And can you imagine, in the midst of all this political divide and all this cultural divide and all this social divide, could you imagine if the church really began to just pray and say, hey, can I have a heart of mercy, Lord? And began to be neighbors to all of these people? I mean, what kind of example would that be? Well, we know exactly what kind of example that would be. Why? Because the first century church did it. And while they were persecuted for it, they were also extremely attractive. And so maybe one of the ways to combat the division is to be great neighbors. And at the center of neighboring is a heart of mercy. God bless you.